let me introduce you to Mike Wroe. And Mike, I thought perhaps we could just start with a relatively brief summary, a helicopter view of your illustrious career in finance.
Yeah, it's probably worth saying to people, Dave, that you and I have known each other for too long. So, and any informal digs should be taken on that basis. So I trained as a chartered accountant. I trained with Touche Ross, now of course Deloitte. Went from there and joined Whitbread. Did 18 months in the Whitbread, effectively their internal audit function. I realised at that point didn't want to work in a big company because the biggest point of discussion amongst everybody within Whitbread was how do I get from grade B to grade C? Nobody actually seemed to want to discuss the business per se. So moved from Whitbread and joined a business called Service Air that did ground handling. So it did all your baggage handling, it did check-in. It had a lot of very expensive bits of kit at airports around the UK to enable you to de-ice aircraft and tow aircraft and do all that. And that was brilliant. And I spent a very happy 5 years there, during which I got promoted into a divisional finance director, working with Air France, which is probably a hot subject of a whole different talk one day. About working, being an entrepreneurial business, working with a French monolith. I went from there and joined a facilities management business, which we rescaled and rebuilt and put on the path to profitability. I then joined a tech business called Innovision, which was my first float. That was an AIM IPO, and I think it's fair to say didn't go that well. We floated just as the tech market crashed in 2001. So we floated at exactly £1. And I think it was about 14 months later, we hit 9 pence. So we lost more than 90% of our value. Some of that was our fault. Some of it we got wrong, the process around listing and how to message your investors. And we did the classic over-promised and under-delivered. And some of it was also the fact that we went into a tech recession, and at the time our customers stopped spending. I did 6 years there, just over 6 years there. I ultimately got sold to Broadcom. We ended up developing near-field communication chips, having pivoted the business in the mid 2000s. Went from there to a small software business. It was in a difficult state when I joined it. They were a great bunch of people, probably suffered from the fact they'd been given too much money too early, had a phenomenal product, but never quite got it to market. I sadly put that business into pre-pack administration, but my proud moment there was I kept it alive probably kept along with the other directors for 6 months longer than it would have done. And we saved everybody's job, ultimately selling it to EDS out of pre-pack administration. At that point, I was on 6 months gardening leave because EDS, it turned out, need another CFO. They already had one based in Texas or somewhere like that. So I started looking for a role and bumped into Just Eat. Joined the Just Eat team in 2008. There was 40 people in the team spread between the UK and Denmark. Denmark is actually where Just Eat started. And was fortunate to ride the rocket ship that was Just Eat. It wasn't a straight line rocket ship, but we took it through significant growth. So it probably had about 4 million of revenue when I joined, just a little bit less. We took it to 100 million of revenue and then floated it on the London Stock Exchange. We were the first business to take advantage of the specialist growth segment that Mr. Cameron's government introduced specially for us, or so he said. We then were, I made up for my previous IPO in that actually that was a success in that we under-promised and over-delivered fairly consistently, I believe. And we grew that business. We floated at 1.3 billion. Ultimately, by the time I left in 2016, we were at about £5 billion and ultimately traded earlier this year to a Dutch company for about 5.5 billion as a takeover. So that's the headlines.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mark. I guess two follow-up questions just on that. One from a member of the audience this evening, Billy, is intrigued by how does one prepare oneself for the IPO experience? And a similar question, Mike. Obviously, back in 2008, did you know what you were getting into in terms of Just Eat, or were you in the right place at the right time? Because obviously it was an incredibly successful business in the long run.
A simple answer was no. When I looked at it, I went for the interview. It was a CFO role advertised with Reed Accountancy, which should have been a warning sign straight away, because it's not your classic place that a CFO role gets advertised, but they'd actually written quite a good description. I went and met the guys. I met David Buttress, who was the became the CEO at IPO, but at the time was running the UK division, and Klaus Neuengard, who was a relatively newly appointed CEO of the group at that point. And I met them in what were described on the outside as luxury offices. If you'll pardon my French, they'd be better described as a and they were in Edgware, and we had the full collection. We had we had mice, rats, flies, ladybirds, every infestation in that office over the few years that we lived there. So all the warning signs were, this is not a successful company, but I really, really enjoyed the company and the various time I spent in the interviews with Klaus and David. And as a result, I was just enthusiastic. They were enthusiastic about the business. They not convinced me, that would be the wrong word. They got me enthused about the business. And I was fortunate enough that I had two offers at the time, one of which was much better paid and with a much more established business, and the Just Eat one, which was less well paid but with more equity. Good decision in the long run, it turned out. And obviously much less established. And I was very fortunate. My wife said to me, just take the one you enjoy. And that's how I ended up at Just Eat. I won't pretend that I had some great vision. We were at the time in a massive fight with a business called Hungry House, which was the only other player of any size in the UK. And we were marginally bigger than them, but not much. And it was the start of what was, an epic battle over the next probably 5 years.
Yeah. Mike, you've always seemed to me that you were always very comfortable acknowledging what you didn't know. So in terms of running up to an IPO, were there any particular critically important points of reference or sources of advice you leveraged?
Yeah, I think there's two things. One, I was slightly advantaged going into this IPO that I'd done it before. Yeah. And I still had the scars of over-promising and under-delivering. So I was very convinced that, that was not the way we as Just Eat were going to go. I think the other piece was, it was mooted probably 3 years before we actually went to IPO that we should think about an IPO. Now, I think all businesses go through that phase. A lot of it's ego, a lot of it's bravado. But as a result of that, I did actually start to think about it. I made a conscious effort to reach out to some bankers. At the time, we met Citibank. I spent a bit of time with Citibank, who at the time were very helpful, and the same with Barclays. And I was fortunate that I bumped into two people who were prepared to share their advice on an informal basis and just point me in the right direction. I then also reached out to a couple. There hadn't been many. You've got to remember, in 2014, there'd been a great dearth of IPOs. So actually, I had to go out and search out some CFOs who've been through some recent IPOs. And again, just ask them the stupid questions on the basis there are new stupid questions. Sure. And that was hugely beneficial. And I think the final piece was, and I can't claim this was my decision. I think it was a combination of Klaus and the board's decision. We were fortunate enough to find a chairman who'd been through an IPO with Telecity before, and had a bit of grey hair, but actually was still very much a young person in his process. So John, I think, really helped to shape the business in the 2 years running up to the IPO. If you look at the time we did our IPO, we IPO'd in early 2014. We'd been planning it for 18 months. Sure. There were two other IPOs that happened at a similar time, which were Boohoo and AO, both of which are great companies, but had only been planning it. I spoke to, to obviously their team because they happened at the same time. They'd only really been planning it for about 3 to 6 months. Yeah. As a result, they made mistakes in that first 12 months that then took them a couple of years to recover thereafter. I think because we'd been a little bit more thoughtful, we didn't make those early mistakes.
Right. I mean, I'm sure we'll come back to the the IPO dynamic, Mike. There's lots of questions online coming from that. If I can just talk to you about, so 2011, 2012, the dynamic of growth, and again, just for for everybody online, growth means in terms of Just Eat, going from a £33 million revenue number in 2011, 5 years later in 2016, hitting 376 million. Mike, how did growth impact on you and the finance team, and how did you grow, and how did your team grow to support those aspirations in clearly a very ambitious business?
I think there's two things. One, I actually went through 3 number 2s. I don't know what role you call group finance controller, group finance director. I went through 3 people in relatively quick succession in 2009 through 2012. Not because anyone failed, but what I needed when we were a £4 million business was a very good bookkeeper. 18 months later, what I needed was a very good predominantly UK-based financial controller. I had that. What I then needed 18 months later was a proper international group finance director. In every case, I had great people at the right time, but I wasn't afraid to say to those people, actually, you know what, your time's up. In a nice way, a polite way, in a way that gave them a reasonable time to find something else, and that we paid them reasonably in that process and looked after them, but wasn't afraid to make sure that I had the right number 2. And I think that's absolutely critical. I think as a CFO, you've got to look at yourself and say, where are my gaps? And I have many, but where are my gaps? And therefore, who should I have as my number 2 who doesn't do what I do? I think it's too easy to recruit a mini me. But I think you need people who have a different set of skills. I am without doubt, a strategy and helicopter person. I was very fortunate that Marcus, who was my group finance director, was very detailed, very process. And I think it's important to make sure you get that. I think the other piece is when you're recruiting for growth, don't look at skills, because skills very quickly become irrelevant. I think you need to look at attitude and enthusiasm. And there was a piece in every interview I did, certainly in those early days, which said to people, look, you've had the job description for the job, but that's valid for the first 24 hours. After that, things will change. We are a fast-growing business. We went from 2 countries to 15 countries. As you say, we went from 30 million to 300 million of revenue, predominantly organic as well, along that way. And I think as a result, you've got to have people who are flexible and who are willing to go and do something different. And now flexibility works both ways, because I think as a business, then you have to give them a rewarding environment in which that flexibility also pays dividends. I think it's really important to recruit for that attitude and commitment piece. And I'm proud to say that looking back, I've developed some extraordinary people who've gone on to be senior finance people elsewhere.
Sure. And just a couple of questions from online, Mike. One from David, in terms of anecdotally, it's often said that it's as critical in terms of success in deciding what you don't do as well as what you do. Were there any particular examples where you made strategic decisions kind of following that motto?
Yeah, I think very much so. I think, and actually, we had an exact session with this. One of the things actually, and I think it's the Danish way, they're a bit more open to outside coaching. As an executive team, we had pretty much every year we'd bring in a really good executive facilitator to sort of shake the executive team down and make sure we were all thinking the right way. And one of those processes was start, stop, continue. And because we were predominantly a very entrepreneurial company, you were right, there was loads of stuff we were going to continue doing, and even more stuff that we were going to start doing, because that was the right thing. And we had a really good facilitator who said, look, there's 6 of you in the team, there's got to be some stops as well. And I think that was a really big piece. And I think the big one ultimately that we made that decision on was going to the US. We looked long and hard about either going to the US organically or through acquisition, and realised actually that as a management team, that would probably stretch us beyond our sensible capabilities. And therefore, it made more sense to double down on growing our UK business and building a moat around our UK business, and growing our sort of European business. And I think that came to pass because I think Australia, which you will remind me of because you were the analyst, one of the analysts on Just Eat at the time, we made a big acquisition in Australia. And I think we underestimated the complexity of time difference, distance, and managing at scale something that's that far away.
Yes, interesting. And Mike, just to pick up that growth and your team dynamic and building people and developing people, a slightly more prosaic view. Do you recall, the criticality of technology choice within finance? Was that a dynamic that played out?
Being blunt, no. We were still, at the time of our IPO, operating on a Danish accounting platform that wasn't really designed for what we did.
Right.
What I think was more important was process. Yep. I think having the right process base. So it was something I was taught on very early on in my career, was that at every month end, have a file that if an auditor turned up, you could hand it over and they could audit it. Yep. So that's properly reconciled account, balance sheet, all the way through every month. Because there will be months when the shit hits the fan, and you can't do a proper month end, but at least the last one was a really good and everything's documented.
Yes.
And when the shit hits the fan a couple of months in a row, without having had that base 2 months ago and that really solid base, you really start to struggle because you lose track, particularly in a growth environment. So I think process more than IT systems was really important for us. Again, it was partly about people. It was about people who were, curious. Having people in your team that are curious, because you can have all the best BI, ERP systems in the world that produce loads of data, but unless you've got people who are properly curious about not what has happened, but why has that happened?
Yes.
I think that is more critical, if I'm honest, than fancy systems.
And Mike, there's been a few questions as you talk. So, one from Victoria, actually, you've referenced the Menulog acquisition in Australia. And I think, when we worked together, you went from 4 geographies to 15. How do you develop those M&A skills and those geographic expansionary skills? And how did you ensure that your team understood those challenges also?
So some of it was the hard way by getting it wrong. I think consistently at Just Eat, we were very good at the small acquisitions. So where we were in country and we were bolting something on, I'll go take a step back to the people. We were consistent about not just in my finance team, but in recruiting country managers who were effectively the people that ran each of our core areas, recruiting exceptional people there. And I think you could see very quickly the difference between an exceptional recruit who would have a brilliant country in development and a good one that would be very average. Yep. But as a result, we had really strong country teams. And therefore, when we did acquisitions that enabled them to bolt on, that worked really well. I think where we were less good was where we were going into virgin territory, or virgin territory for us and making acquisitions. Yeah. And the learning from that, which, having made a couple of mistakes in that area, the learning from that was actually to have a dedicated team. And a dedicated team that went from before to at least 100 days after. Yeah. So I had a lady, Nikki, who in my team, who was my M&A controller. We weren't big on titles in Just Eat. But that was effectively her role as my M&A controller. And prior to that, she'd been my international financial controller. So she knew our business inside out. And she sat alongside our corporate development director, Frank, and the two of them built a plan to do the acquisition. And it was also Nikki's job, having done the acquisition, to do the 100-day plan of integration. And I think that's critical, that you don't just toss it over the fence. You don't have this acquisitions machine that goes, yeah, we've done a brilliant acquisition. There you go, operations. Oh, you've screwed it up. Yeah. And I think that's really important, that somebody carries in a lot of the learnings. And I think, again, coming back to people, in a lot of cases, you're buying people. And having built the relationship with those people that you bought, they feel really weird when suddenly, oh, Nikki's been lovely and it's been great dealing with Nikki. Oh, where you bought us now? Where's Nikki gone? And I think that's a.
And Mike, there's a question actually from Mike at BDO. Difficult question actually. If you were to reflect on your biggest mistake at Just Eat, I don't know if you're comfortable talking about that.
Yeah. There's so many to choose from.
Stick to one, right? Stick to one. What would you describe?
Biggest financial mistake was probably Australia. We overpaid for Australia. And I'm not saying anything out of turn because they've written it down to half the value we bought it at in the account. So we overpaid for that. It was a competitive environment. It was a game-changing acquisition. Every red flag in the book should have been there. I think we were on a roll. We're not being beaten by these other people who were trying to buy it. It was a lot of ego and perhaps less process.
Sure.
I would say it's a great business. Menulog is an excellent business. We just overpaid for it. Right. I think the other enduring piece that I feel I failed on was getting my head around tech efficiency. So we went from a tech team of, I think it was like 4 when I joined, but for quite a long period we had about 20, and we seemed to be quite good at churning stuff out. And we ended up with a tech team of 300 to 400 people by the time I'd left. And if I'm honest, I'm not sure I ever really got to the bottom of what 300 to 400 people were delivering over and above what the 30 people did 5 years out. And as I look back, I'm not sure I have an answer for it. I'm going to put my hands up to know.
I think that's a fair. I think many of us would share that experience, Mike. And the question from Louise was, clearly incredibly high rates of growth sustained over multi-years. How did you carry your team with you, or was that very natural and organic?
I looked after my team. I am a manager by walking about, so I spend an awful lot of time with my time. Do you know what? I would dread being an active CFO in the current climate, because I think a lot of the techniques I developed would have been really hard to use during this, the last 6 months or so remote learning. So I was very, very close to my team. I always took the blame. I think that's really critical. If you want your team to do anything for you, you have to be the one that stands up and says, actually, I screwed up. You might have a separate conversation with your team about it later, but in terms of public, you're the one that takes the rap. I think also making sure that you were aware when people were completely broken. And we did break people, Just Eat. Yeah. When you're running, we had 50% growth in from month to month in some months, typically October. And I think as a result, people would run ragged. And I think knowing when to send somebody home, I think is important in that growth environment. And finally, one of the learnings I had was have a project resource. In a fast-growing environment, there will always be a project, whether it's raising some debt, whether it's going into the next funding round, whether it's doing an acquisition. And therefore having a bright, I use the phrase bright young thing, somebody there who is almost like an accountant without portfolio in your team is just so useful. And I used to get pushback quite often from other members of the exec team going, well, you've got a spare person. And then mysteriously that spare person would be borrowed by the chief exec or by our technology director to help them out with a project. So...
Interesting. And Mike, on a slightly different tack. So I guess, I think Just Eat completed their final private equity raise in 2011. I think
2012. It was 2011 was the round led by 83 North, and 2012 was the Vitruvian round.
Right. How and often I'm sure many of us have looked at opportunities or working companies where we have private equity ownership. Any learnings from your time in terms of how to manage those relationships better, not worse?
I think how you start is how you will continue. So I was always quite keen to establish early on, and actually even before we started the relationship, in terms of this is, I use the phrase my business. It is our business. We know how to run this business. You are buying into this business because you have a bunch of execs who know how to run this business. Do not send me 8 of your 12-year-old analysts who are super bright and all been to Harvard and done whatever, who then turn up and tell me how to run the business. And I think being very clear about that early on, they are hugely valuable when you have a specific project they can help you on. But you can be very quickly, you can let the bright analysts in, and before you know it, you're overrun. Because what they're doing is going, well, I've been through this data, and can you fix this? And yes, some of this stuff you fix, but you've got to have focus as a business leader. And there's stuff at the edges. Sorry, I'm waving my hands around, you can't see it. But there's stuff at the edges that you'll come back to. But when you've got somebody reporting into your private equity house going, oh, they've not fixed this, they've not fixed that. So I think set the rules early on and try to do it on your terms early on. Because once you've established a pattern, you've lost.
Right. And as you approach this significant event, Mike, in 2014, the IPO, give us a sense of what the finance team looked like and how different was life after the IPO, or was it exactly the same?
No, it was very, very, very different after the IPO. So let's start with the team. I think in the planning stages, the bit that I hadn't appreciated was just the production of on-time internal results and delivering a fully fledged annual report effectively within 2 months of the year end, and doing the quarterlies and the 6-monthly reporting meant that actually you had to have a reporting team. You had to have somebody who was very, very technically strong. And we were fortunate, we found somebody, and if you find those people, they're quite often like tech people. They're quite introverted typically because they enjoy the technicalities of accounting. But if you find the right person, they are invaluable in helping you make sure that the business is properly prepared. When you're doing an acquisition, they look at actually how it's going to be accounted for, which I think again is a common screw up. And so I had a reporting team of 3 people, which blew my mind in terms of from a cost point of view, but just meant that actually they dealt with the rigors of being a PLC, and everybody else got on with running the business. And that was really important, because I think it's very easy for the challenge of an IPO to effectively mean that there's nobody running the business, particularly within the finance team, because everybody gets sucked into the process. So that was the thing. I think in terms of how did it change afterwards, I remember being told that, once you've done the IPO, you'll get a nice break. You can sort out all those things you've had on your list of things to do after the IPO. And they lie, because within 2 days, somebody knocked on my door and went, how are you thinking we're going to do the quarterly statement? And I'm like, well, that's 4 to 6 weeks ago. Yeah, but we should start drafting it now. So, oh, right, okay. And so we IPO'd in April, and we did our first quarterly results sort of early May. And straight away, I was back into being drawn into that world of talking to analysts and investors. And so my role very quickly switched from being deeply involved in the culture and the organization to being way too heavily involved in investor relations, effectively, investor and analyst relations. And I think the other big shock to me was in September. I remember somebody going to me in September going, have you started writing your annual report yet? And I was going, but our year ends the 31st of December. Why would I have started writing the annual report? And they were bang on. Because of all the stuff that you write at the front of a public annual report, we had to start writing it in September. And it was only by doing that you had any chance of getting it done within 2 months of the year end. So that was a very, very different process to doing it. And ultimately, I guess that's ultimately why I stepped down from being CFO sort of 2.5, 3 years afterwards, is it wasn't the job I enjoyed anymore. It was a political, corporate governance, investor relations role, not an operational finance and build a business role.
Yeah. And so it seems as if you're describing a landscape whereby that initial public offering pretty much comprehensively redefined your role, it sounds like.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's very much right. And I think there's ways to mitigate that. I think we could have been more organised with our own investor relations planning. It took me 6 months to find an investor relations manager, and that helped dramatically. But unfortunately, again, it goes back to what I said about when private equity starts. Almost the patterns you develop early on become the patterns that people expect.
Sure.
So, for example, you as our analyst, you at the time were, I spent a lot of time talking to you. It was very difficult 6 months in, once I had an investor relations person, to go to you and say, actually, you know what, I'm not talking to you anymore, because that pattern of discussion had already happened, and that was with a group of people. So I think being prepared for that and having somebody who's going to pick that up from day one, so you have the behaviour pattern sorted. I think the other thing is as you know, our chief exec was a very hands-on operational chief exec, very deeply involved in the business. And I guess I stepped probably more into the gap of the investor relations and the corporate governance piece to allow him to get stuck into continuing to build the business.
Right.
And I think getting that mix of roles right, because it may be you have a CEO who loves being out there and talking to analysts and doing all that and loves the presentation piece. And in that situation, maybe the role changes slightly less.
Sure. So it almost feels as if the personality and the desire of the chief executive and chief financial officer together somehow characterize a division of responsibilities that may be different from one company to another, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's very much the case, because it would be very easy for both of you to spend 120% of your time on the city, corporate governance, investor relations, all that sort of thing. In reality, it should probably be the equivalent of 2/3 of one person. And I guess the question is whether that's a third and a third, or whether it's a half and a whatever's left. Is it a sixth? A half, that way. And I think that really does matter.
Super interesting. Sorry, Mike, go on.
No, I was going to say, so my example might be very different to other people's, because I certainly know of other chief execs who just loved being on that circuit.
Yeah.
And I guess it's probably something to think about before you get that far. So before you go into the IPO, really think about actually what do people want to do. And if somebody has a real desire to do it, that's brilliant. But then you, of course, have to make sure you backfill. So if it's a chief exec who's going to go off and, do the lunches and do the conferences and do all that, that's brilliant. But you need to make sure you backfill, because, and have a great COO, CFO combination in that point, still about running the business.
And so for those of you online who are, wondering what this city thing is, there's a very good BBC drama on right now called Industry, which actually gives a very intriguing insight into what the city is. And, at the risk of offending Mike's modesty, as the CFO of Just Eat as a public company, Mike's execution of the role was just head and shoulders pretty much above every other listed technology business in the UK. And I think Mike had a particular model of talking to the city about Just Eat's performance and a rule of thumb. I don't know if you want to talk about that, Mike, in terms of what I always thought was your golden rule.
Well, under promise and over deliver.
Complete.
Yeah, 100%. And that, like I say, I had the scars from the first IPO I did back in 2001, where we did the opposite. And every time I went back, I was explaining why we'd missed. So we never ever got the chance to present what we were doing well, because every time you went in, you were apologizing for the fact you missed the numbers, explaining why you missed the numbers. And unlike when you're dealing with your private equity or your venture capital owners, where they'll quite happily sit down for an afternoon with you and you can play for the numbers and go, actually, do you know what? I know we said we deliver 15% margins, and we delivered 14.8, and this is why. In the public world, you get 45 minutes, and they have a clear set of agenda of what they want to play to. So you never get the chance to explain. In fact, I think it might have been you, David, who said, if you have to explain it, you've lost. So you need to be very clear that if you think you're going to do somewhere between 14.5% and 15% margins, you need to be telling the city it's 14 to 14.5 to make sure that even at the bottom of your range, you're ahead of it.
Sure.
Because otherwise, if you might look at it and go, I've done 14.9, I promised 15, surely I'm there. The city go, oh, you missed your margin number. And it's just a completely different world because you don't have that ability to explain. And it's hard work in terms of managing that expectation. You have to spend because you do not go out and tell people what your numbers are. The analysts, it's slightly different in the US, I guess, but certainly in the UK, the analysts decide what your numbers are. And again, you've got a bunch of bright people who, our present company accepted, and who plough into your numbers and effectively rebuild your model from what you've said over the years. And actually, therefore, they're coming to a number and you have to give them an excuse as to why, please, I'm going to do 100 million of revenue. I know I'm going to do 100 million of revenue. You're saying I'm going to do 100 million of revenue, but I'd like to give myself some wiggle room. So trying to talk that down to 96 million is brilliant. I mean, you and I had a joke once where your model of, I think the model I managed to build out to the city was that we were going to make, I can't remember the revenue number, but it was about 13 million of profit. And you turned up one day and said, I'm going out with 14.6 million of profit because I've done all the numbers and that's what you're going to deliver. Unfortunately, that was exactly the number I had in my plan as well. And that was the number we were going to deliver. And I hated you for it. I still hate you for it.
Sorry.
Yeah. So, but I've been talking everyone down. So I did put a disproportionate amount of effort for that reporting season into making sure it wasn't 14.6.
I remember that. And just harking back to Billy's question from the beginning, Mike, that post-IPO role just feels radically different to the growth-focused, team-building, skill-developing role you executed prior to that. Remind us again, how is that? Do you learn on the job, or was there somebody you referred to who said, no, Mike, it's exactly like this, and indeed it was? Or
I learned on the job. Again, having done it before, I really, again, having the lead up time, I think as part of that 18-month planning into our IPO rather than 6-month planning into IPO, there were certain elements that you were able to do. So you do what's called a pre-look, where you will go and meet half a dozen legal and generals or, Bank of America, potential big investors, and effectively you get to practice on them for a year before you actually go to IPO. I think that helps, and doing that and doing it seriously really helps. Again, our chairman was really, really helpful in terms of this is what it's going to look like afterwards. And then the final bit is we had advised a guy called Christian Mayer. You may remember him. He was, whereas we had two big banks, we had Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, who ultimately did our IPO. We also had a small corporate advisory firm. We had two. We had Torch Partners, who'd done a lot of our VC rounds up to that point. But then we had Oakley Capital, as we go. And Christian was really helpful as being a management advisor. I think he'd done your sort of analyst role before and was able to be really helpful before we went into the lion's den and say to us, look, guys, this is what's going to happen. And he played the devil's advocate in a lot of those early meetings that enabled us, I think, to be prepared for the world we were going into. But even so, it was a shock. I think I came out of it and I genuinely thought that I would go back to being the guy who ran the finance team. Yeah. Now, I'd sort of prepared for the worst in that I had a really strong team under me, a really strong, group of lieutenants. And thank God I did, because I think if I hadn't have had that strong group of lieutenants, I think the first 6 months afterwards would have killed me. And that was different. That was something I couldn't have learned from my first IPO, because my first IPO, nobody cared. We were an AIM business with no revenue. When we floated, we were a highly successful tech business that were changing the world of takeaway food.
Sure. And I think, Mike, David Buttress, the chief executive, I think he coined this phrase, but it's an interesting phrase. So I remember people describing you, and perhaps it was David, the chief executive, as the chief culture officer at Just Eat, which seemed a really unusual role up for an archetypal CFO to fulfill. Was that accurate? And how did you get into that?
Yeah, so very, very interesting. It came about, it's very early on. So even before I joined, Just Eat was a company where having fun was a core part. We were in takeaway food. It was long hours, predominantly late night hours. And therefore there was a culture of having fun. We had good parties. We went out as a team, and predominantly we drank, but there was lots of other things we did as well. And I think, so early on, there was a pressure to maintain that because it was seen as a core part of our culture. I'm not sure there's any marketing people on listening here, but apologies there. But our marketing team offered to run what we used to call our World Party, which was our annual get together for everyone. And given what I knew about our marketing team's ability to spend advertising money, I was slightly worried they'd bankrupt the company doing it. So I sort of offered by default to run the party, basically to keep tabs on costs, because it was a point where we were very close to raising new money. So I ended up running it by accident. I quite enjoyed it. I think I was quite good at it, and therefore got given the job in the long term. And it was really interesting. So just before IPO, I went and did a session with Deloitte. Deloitte do basically where they study you as a CFO. You fill in loads of questionnaires and they look at where you spend your time and do all that. And they pulled out my thing and said, you spend this much time on stewardship, you spend this much time on planning and forecasting. And you've got this other big bit that not a lot of other CFOs do, which is culture. You shouldn't be doing that as CFO. It was a very blunt, as CFO, that is not your job. Culture is not your job. And it was interesting, that caused me to think. And number one, they're wrong. As CFO, it is as much your job as everybody else's job on the exec team. And I think the reason a lot of finance teams and finance professionals are unsuccessful is they don't see the people stuff as important. Sure. It is more important than anything else. I used to fight for a travel budget for my team to make sure they went out to spend face-to-face time. So I got there, and it was interesting. So I went back and I talked to David, the chief exec, at that point. I said, look, they've been very clear. I need to give up the culture stuff. I need to go and be a proper CFO and do that. And his words were, over my dead body, we'll employ somebody to do the other stuff. Right. Because the culture stuff is absolutely critical in what you do. So yes, it was atypical, but I think the big thing people should take away is, as finance, you have got to be at the heart of the business. Yep. Not so that you don't know what happened last month, you know what's going to happen next month. And that means being face-to-face, it means being approachable, it means not being in a separate business. I was very proud. My legal reported into me. I ultimately ended up with a legal team of 6 because of the number of countries around. And we used to have an annual award for the jammiest team, which was sort of our cultural award for the team that was seen as the most representative of Just Eat. And the legal team won it one year. And that actually was probably one of my proudest moments, that actually a bunch of lawyers had managed to be so integral to the business that they were seen as, the most culturally contributable.
Yeah. And it's interesting, Mike. Obviously, I think everybody would agree that 2020 has been an extraordinary year for a whole variety of dynamics. But I think perhaps one of the positives that continues to grow is the commercial awareness, the business awareness of mental well-being and having to deal with stress and getting that work-life balance right. How did you contribute to the cultural value of that within Just Eat?
Probably, but I'm not sure it was a particularly good example. I'm not sure I got work-life balance right. I've achieved it slightly after in that I worked, and then I then slowed down afterwards. But I think we dealt with the work-life balance by having a fun. And fun is a really terrible word because it sounds trite. It's not meant to sound trite at all. It is really, it's about having a bunch of people who like being with each other. And I think that takes a big part of the stress out. So that's not like-minded people. We used to argue like cats and dogs, but we liked spending time together. And I think we made sure when we got to breaking point that we went and did something. We went and we did clay pigeon shooting as a team. And it wasn't the senior team. We went out and in fact, every team in the business had a sort of staff entertaining business budget once a quarter to go and do something with their team. And I think that was critical to maintaining that health. I think mental health, I think the big challenge with mental health is people can pretend on Zoom. People can pretend they're well, that they're coping otherwise. And as a result, I think at the moment, it's really difficult to spot when somebody's head goes down. You'd come out many a time at Just Eat, you'd come out of a meeting, somebody looked like it'd gone well. You'd be going out to get a sandwich for lunch and you'd look across the office and they'd sort of be sat a bit slumped. Yeah. And actually, you go over, you metaphorically put your arm around them because it's not allowed anymore to do anything other than metaphorical. You put your arm around them and say, everything all right? And at that point, you get actually, it's not really. I thought I did a really good job on that and I got shouted down. And I think that is really difficult. I thought I saw a really interesting comment by somebody, which is, as a manager, as a leader, you need to get off Zoom at least half your time and start phoning people, having one-to-one where people do not feel like they're on display. You've got to, it's so easy to do 8 hours of Zoom and go, oh, blimey, I've been really busy and spent a lot of time with people. And I think if you think about the number of times you would have a short one-to-one with a member of your team during a day, you need to see if you can replicate that. And I think the problem is as well, Zoom is always half an hour or an hour. And in reality, you probably just need a 5-minute phone call. All right, Dave, how are you going? How's that project? How are you feeling? And sometimes the 5 minutes turns into 20 minutes, but that's good. And sometimes the 5 minutes is great. Thank you very much.
Interesting. And Mike, as we begin to perceive running out of time, tell us about your finance career post Just Eat. What have you been up to, and how do you spend your time these days?
I spent a year trying to work out what I was going to do, and I think catching up on sleep. I think that was an important part. What I then developed into is I do CFO mentoring. For people I like. So one rule we used to have at Just Eat was no arseholes. Something I have taken with me beyond Just Eat. So for people I like, I do CFO mentoring on a sort of one-to-one basis or once a month, just helping out there. And alongside that, I have become a sort of business. I'm a board advisor. I sit on a board with you of the Dragons rugby team. I'm not sure it counts as a business, but it's certainly great fun. I've just become chairman of a business called ProSapient, which is an expert network. So I'm building up a career where I'm advising people in that space in the run up to IPO, in the 3 to 4 years before IPO. Because of what I realize is that's where I think I can add the most value. I think I can add a lot of value post IPO, but it's the bit that I can add the most value and enjoy what I do as well. So that's what I'm doing. And advisory and trying to help people deal with the growth challenge.
And just a last minute kind of detailed question, Mike, from Lawrence. Where do you see the CFO, the finance functions input around, or how was it at Just Eat with regard to decisions around pricing and the commission rate for the restaurants and the like? Critical or peripheral?
Absolutely critical. And it's not a one-off process. My experience of the last 3 years, I've spent a lot of time in businesses. Typically, most businesses undercharge. They're afraid to put their prices up. I think, one of the big learnings from Just Eat is sometimes you just have to be brave. You need to have a good excuse why you're putting your prices up so that people don't feel like you're just taking advantage. But I think you need to be brave, and people consistently across the course need to do that. I think the other piece is the importance of testing. So we would pick a region, or we would pick a subset, and we would test what we were going to do. And I think that's absolutely critical. There is no magic formula that gives you the answer, because human beings are the people who are receiving your price increases, and the human beings behave in very different ways. So I think testing it, being prepared but being brave, I think is absolutely critical.
Interesting. Mike, when you were talking about what you do now, you didn't mention guide dogs.
Thank you. Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I've very recently become a trustee of guide dogs. It was my desire to give something back. My grandfather was blind. I didn't know him. He died when I was quite young, but he was blind, and therefore I grew up playing with a set of blind dominoes, which are interesting because they're bump dominoes.
Sure.
So I think it'd always been in the back of my mind that sort of charity would be good for me. And Guide Dogs is excellent. It's a large charity. We employ over 1,000 people, and we have almost 18,000 volunteers. We have 5,000 guide dogs in the field. And the aim is to try and increase that. It's a constant challenge because you're dealing with humans and dogs, both of which have a huge amount of variables. And this year has been a very tough year in that respect. But in addition to the guide dogs, we help about 17,000 other people a year with blind services. So I think some of the recent adverts that have been out there have been helping blind and partially sighted children as they're going back to school.
Sure.
And providing the support around that. So although we are guide dogs, we are a blind, mobility support charity. And I'm really enjoying it. It's very different to what I've been used to, in that there are a different set of rules around the Charities Commission and how things happen. But I think, it's a great charity that is changing lives.
Yeah, fantastic. Brilliant. Well, Mike, I think, I hope everybody has really enjoyed our 55 minutes of conversation. I know I did. Super informative and very engaging, Mike. Thank you so much.